So this also lets me introduce you to what we're going to be doing for the second half of the term in terms of with the lectures. So the overall proposal is that globalization doesn't work anymore as an adequate category to describe both the general condition of the planet at the minute, but also specifically as the kind of common discourse for contemporary art to talk about its internationalism and in the way that it's been constructed over the past 20 years or so. And as we saw with the first set of lectures, one of the reasons it doesn't work anymore is because the Anthropocene has taken over as the name for the total image in a way. Once it was globalization, which is something set up by trade channels, politics, so on and so forth, the material conditions of the environment and the Anthropocene, if you follow that discourse, says what constructs the planetary condition, which the global one stood for, is now another condition called the Anthropocene, which is kind of greater than globalization. What we're going to do in the second half of this term is talk about, in a way, the counterpoint to the Anthropocene discourse. Right? So the Anthropocene is the totality of the planet. What's often put up as a counterpoint to that is localism, that the local somehow is a way of resisting globalization, that you call up on traditions or cultures from a specific place as a way to kind of resist the depredation and the kind of the terrible forces of globalization, which stands in for some sort of abstract notional capitalism, usually. The problem we have today is that the local doesn't really function as a site of resistance anymore. And partly, and this is, I think, the thing that we're going to test over the coming 5 lectures. And one of the reasons it doesn't work, kind of stated or proposed in the in this bit of the blurb here, is that the local is itself now constituted by forces which are not local. Okay, so the cell phone, the computer, the internet are not local, but somehow they define constituencies. I mean, you can understand this very quickly through art scenes. How do you find out about an opening in London? Through the internet. Okay, and some level, the opening in London through the internet works the same way as an opening in Detroit through Contemporary Art Daily. You can't get to it, but the conditions of circulation are the same. Similarly, the notion of the border or the boundary is that which blocks off or defines locality against forces outside, abstract, global forces, doesn't really work because borders themselves are in transition. Borders are changing. So borders are no longer something that one transits over, something stable that you go from one place to another, but the border itself is in transition, and it's in transition for a number of reasons. One, because the regional blocs which constitute modern economies, like the Asia and Southeast Asia network, ASEAN, or the NAFTA, North Atlantic Free Trade Arrangement, or the European Union, are themselves changing the notion of the border from a nation-state condition, which is the one that we're familiar with, to something that sort of operates between the nation-state and sort of transnational or trans-statist conditions, right? And also, as we've seen with the recent migrant crisis or refugee crisis in Europe, the border itself, it's not clear what it means. It's not clear whether the border of Europe is in Serbia, if it's in Croatia, if it's at the border of Germany or Austria, or if it's happening between France and the UK. These things are kind of themselves in movement. So the notion of a border as something to be crossed over, which would be the way that you could organize and define a local, is now very weak. Okay? So that's the broad condition. So the issue then is if we look to the local as a way to put questions to or resist or refute or challenge globalization, we can't use standard notions of the local, old familiar notions of the local. The local is something stable and set. Okay? We need other notions of the local, or we have to abandon the notion of the local altogether. And if we do that, the problem that emerges is on what basis can we challenge globalization as an abstract mechanism, okay, as an abstract force? Because the assumption is that we should in this discussion. So that's the broad issue that we want to develop. We will develop in the second set of lectures. So it's very appropriate and very good, I think, that Alex is here to do the first lecture in the series because he's against the local.
In inverted commas.
In inverted commas. Yeah. Well, the inverted commas are against the local rather than against. He's definitely against something called the local. We're not sure what it is. So let me introduce Alex. Alex is teaching at City University, which he's just come from. So, like, he's really teaching at City University. And he's recently completed PhD at University of East London with Jeremy Gilbert on the concept of hegemony, which I think you'll be speaking about today somewhat. No?
You can ask me questions.
Okay, I'll ask him questions about the notion of hegemony,
I try to stay on topic.
which he's been working on for some time. But you might know Alex more familiarly as the author of this book, Inventing the Future, which has just recently come out 2 weeks ago, I think, or 3 weeks ago, from Verso, which he co-authored with Nick Cernak. And I think you're doing a world tour at the minute promoting the book. It's available for £10 from Verso, the Verso website. I really urge you to get this book. I think it's going to be a book that defines the next few years of theoretical and political debate globally. Okay, this book doesn't fuck around. It goes straight to the problem of the malaise of anti-capitalist or anti-right-wing forces, and why we are currently ineffective and can't have traction on the forces of globalization, as capitalism as globalization. And not just in a kind of sense of, it doesn't just do it as a series of complaints about the left, though it does complain about the left too, and the right. It also proposes a program for how to deal with this, and I think you'll be speaking about that somewhat today. So that's Alex, and I'll leave it to you at this point. Let me just get you on your, that's yours.
Great, thank you. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking, my talk's entitled Against the Local. The inverted commas have gone somewhat missing there, but it's essentially a talk which is largely about trying to critically assess what we mean by the local. And I think this is important because today notions of the local have exploded across a variety of ideological and disciplinary contexts. So I first started noticing this kind of after the financial crisis of 2008. Suddenly, everybody started talking about the local, localism, and what was curious to me, or what I found fascinating, was the fact that it wasn't just people from one kind of sector. It wasn't just people on the right, or people on the left, or people in the middle, and it wasn't just people in the world of politics, but it was also people in the world of kind of aesthetics, in the world of food, in the world of economics. There was a very curious thing was going on. So I became very interested in this idea of this kind of trans-political ideology, this idea that the local is small is beautiful, the local is authentic, the local is virtuous, ethically sound, politically radical, intrinsically. But an idea of all of that which seemingly everybody agrees with. This in itself is interesting, I think. So this talk is basically going to be a critique of these tendencies, largely in political and philosophical terms. And basically, should I have time to get to the conclusion, basically leads to a kind of argument that we need to reconsider what the local is, and offer a variety of ways that we could begin to do that. Okay, so we're going to start with, it comes in 3 parts. Part 1, the local as ideological object. So what's it doing? What space is it filling within this kind of various different kinds of ideological projects? So first of all, we're going to begin, talk about right-wing political localism with this charming chap, David Cameron. So political localism was kind of at the core of what David Cameron wanted to do with his so-called big society idea. So this was allegedly at the heart of the last coalition administration that was running this country for the previous 5 years. And the basic idea was to integrate the free market with a theory of social solidarity based on basically voluntarism to some extent. And the term was invented by a guy called Steve Hilton. He was his director of strategy. And the idea actually became the kind of flagship policy of the 2010 UK Conservative Party General Election Manifesto. It was supposed to create an environment in which local people and communities would start to build a big society. I mean, the name big society might not resonate in a UK context, but in a kind of US context, they're kind of intending it versus the big state. Instead of the big state, big government, we're going to have a big society, which sounds very nice, and this is the kind of the intention behind it. And the idea was give communities more powers, encourage people to take an active role in their communities. Transfer powers from central to local government, support co-ops, mutuals, charities, social enterprises, and all of this. We will return to this in the next part when we find out what's wrong with this. But we'll continue our whistle-stop tour of localism. From the other side, you have kind of a vast kind of swathe of left-wing politics, which certainly has its localist tendencies. So these would include kind of neo-anarchists, communization theorists, and probably most practically people like Occupy Wall Street and sort of similar movements. So in Spain, 15M. Similarly, so this is the idea that the spatially immediate is a kind of privileged space of politics. So you have a kind of localized politics of direct action. Action should be taken directly rather than through mediated processes. You're going to directly confront the problems that you've identified. It's going to consist of sort of some mixture of deliberative democracy featuring assemblies, which are usually person to person. They're normally kind of face-to-face meetings. They'll often use things like consensus decision making. So that's a particular way of running deliberative democracy, where you need to have everybody agree, and there's various processes in place by which you can kind of administrate that. This kind of politics generally emphasizes spatial, temporal, and conceptual immediacy. So politics that is going to happen right now rather than in 5 years' time, partly unplanned, ad hoc, spontaneous. But we also, aside from right and left, there's also been a variety of local economics initiatives are being proposed. So there's a vast swathe of different forms that these take. But two or three of them. So one of the big ones is kind of an interest in the idea of local banking. So this is all stuff that kicked off after the 2008 crisis. So part of the idea is that the global banking system has become is just irredeemably corrupt and dangerous. And as a result, there were, especially in the United States, less so here, there are a series of campaigns called Move Your Money campaigns. The idea was we've got to move our money out of these dangerous banks and into nicer banks that are smaller scaled and which are likely to not be involved in speculative investment. There are also kind of local money campaigns. So you might have seen some of these. There's like the Bristol pound. I think there's a Brixton pound as well. So these are schemes which are designed to you create a new kind of currency which is only kind of valid within a given kind of spatial locality, and this is designed to keep the money, this particular type of money, circulating only within that community. So the idea is that this money doesn't leave the community. So it encourages people to go and shop in local shops and local businesses. So this is the kind of economic localism. Again, we're going to return to why this is problematic. But I would suggest, kind of vis-a-vis what Suhail was saying at the start, we might already have an idea in the sense that money circulates, commodities circulate globally. It's hard to necessarily see how this is going to work in practice. But on the kind of more aesthetic side of things, there's been a vast movement towards a kind of sort of intermingling set of kind of tendencies around food, the kind of consumption aesthetics of food. So this includes things like local food, slow food, what also gets called locavorism, which means eating locally, also known as the 100-mile diet. So this is the idea that you should only eat food sourced within 100 miles of where you are. And the idea behind this, has a number of kind of like benefits that are claimed for it. So some of these are that it gets you back in touch with nature and with community. But there's also an implicit idea that the kind of 100-mile diet is going to help fight climate change, because it's found an easy metric by which we're going to check that food is going to be, it's not going to run up lots of carbon emissions by having to be transported all the way around the world. At least this is the idea. And in essence, there's a sense that you, within the kind of food localist movement, slow food, local food, that we're going to kind of compress quite complex issues down into relatively simple heuristics, behavioural heuristics, which you can apply yourself. There's also sort of simultaneously, although obviously it's been going for quite some time, site specificity in the art world. Creating a work that's integrated with its surroundings, that's been generated with a particular relationship to the topography of its locale. Increasingly, kind of over the last decade, 15 years, especially in places like the UK, there's been a lot of local communities, towns and cities have begun to kind of finance this stuff as a way to, use art to help explore the specific features of their communities. It's supposed to kind of champion an idiosyncratic specificity against the forces of global homogenization. So it's supposed to only really work in this kind of particular space. And in this sense, kind of oppose some of the kind of complex global forces which are kind of forces of homogenization and everything else. And yet, kind of as a lot of critics would say, often this kind of art is often set in motion by some of those very same forces, the art market and so on. So this was a very brief guided tour. So part two, what's the problem with localism? What's wrong with it? So we'd sort of put it together. The idea is, I guess, across all these different types of localisms, is that the local is authentic, it's democratic, it's a kind of privileged sphere of political and aesthetic action and thought. It's easy to understand, so it's kind of tractable to thought and action. It's familiar, and it's the kind of space in which we can bring the world down to size, down to our size. This all sounds quite good. This all sounds quite nice. So what's wrong with this? Well, it's not entirely bad, but I think a lot of the time in this form, localism is either ends up being duplicitous or ineffectual. So it's either grounded in a kind of outright kind of dissemblance, or it doesn't work very well. So we'll examine why. So the kind of right-wing political localism, it's kind of communitarian politics that David Cameron's very fond of, but also a variety of kind of neoliberal, allegedly left parties, but are basically centre-right. They're also interested in this. Communitarian politics, has habitually gone hand in hand with neoliberal economic measures. So, for example, the big society, you would have policy documents which would have a list of providers who might be called upon to provide a given service. And it would normally include a sort of list of nice-sounding organisations like charities, NGOs, maybe religious organisations, and then in very small print, also large outsourcing organisations. And in almost every instance, it was, unsurprisingly, the very large and effective organisations in terms of winning these bids, the large outsourcers that tended to win them. So what happened was basically the big society agenda was a kind of ideological cloak for fairly standard, non-localised neoliberal reforms that we've seen before. And it often amounted to simply the idea that charities should step in to help the poor when the state pulls back. For example, vast growth in food banks and all this kind of stuff you could see this as part of the big society. But what it has done is it's effectively channeled a kind of anti-big state zeitgeist, which is partially the result of what gets called the kind of 1960s anti-systemic movement. So this is the kind of stuff that people like Giovanni Arrighi talked about, which you might think of as the kind of 60s hippie moment, but which extended far beyond that into a kind of general, they would argue, global sudden resistance against administration, against large kind of organisational control, and also partially as a result of kind of growing cynicism with post-democratic politics. Because why do you want the big state? You don't, because it's corrupt. All politicians are the same. But what this ends up doing, the big society, similar initiatives, even ones that are being discussed by elements of the Labour Party today, related to mutualising the NHS, for example, they're often taken, if you look at the small print, what they will end up leading towards is this kind of privatised provision. So you end up, we have a promise of decentralisation, but what you actually end up with is heavily centralised bureaucracies that just happen to be run by corporations. So, in fact, almost the complete opposite of what the agenda is supposed to allegedly deliver. So, right-wing political localism is generally quite duplicitous. Left-wing political localism, less obviously duplicitous, still problematic in many senses. So, here you can kind of see a lot of the politics of movements that want to organise on a kind of local scale can often be seen as a kind of reaction to irreducible complexity. So the social world is incredibly complex, and the kind of phenomena that Sue Hell was talking about at the top of the lecture, phenomena like globalisation, global capitalism, global trade, financial crisis, and climate change, these are all very hard to kind of wrap our heads around, not in the sense of understanding that they're happening, but thinking about our precise relationship to them. You kind of think, okay, well, I know this is bad, I know this is happening, but how do I operate within this? What do I do? What's the takeaway message of what I'm supposed to do in this situation? So one of the this is a question which Frederick Jameson will talk about through the idea of cognitive mapping. This is just, what's my relationship to the structures that are kind of far beyond my immediate purview? So this is really a sort of problem of representation. But what happens some of the time, or in the most localizing tendencies within kind of left localism, is that you kind of avoid that and you end up fetishizing a local horizon of action because it's tractable, it's understandable, we know what we're doing, we understand what's happening. So this may lead, not in all cases, but in some cases, towards a non-scalability. So a question about how do we scale these kinds of movements up? How do we, especially movements that are kind of pitted against globalized abstract phenomena, climate change, global capitalism. So you have a kind of a lovely question which was raised by Mackenzie Walk around the time of the Occupy movement taking off a few years ago in New York. And he said that the real question we need to ask is, how do we occupy an abstraction? Because Wall Street, it's a physical place. I've been there, presumably some of you have been there. But, well, for one thing, the banks, mostly the investment banks, which were the kind of initial target of the protest, most of them aren't down there anymore. They're elsewhere in New York. But also, Wall Street is an idea. It's not really a physical place. It's standing in as an abstraction for this kind of broader system. So how do you occupy that? It's unclear as to how you would actually do that. So when taken alone, these kinds of politics might be ineffective, but maybe when combined with other forms, they could be more effective. Economic localism. If any of you are interested in this, there's a book by the political economist Greg Schartzer called No Local, which is very, very good on demolishing a lot of the claims towards economic localism. So I'll just repeat some of his points here because he covers this much better than I can. He basically says that sort of economic issues where you have a kind of the idea that we're going to solve systemic economic problems by focusing on small businesses, ethical shopping, local currencies, small-scale community initiatives. And Schartzer argues that at the core of these ideas is basically a refusal to think systematically, to ignore, in his case he's a Marxist, so he says, you're ignoring what's going on structurally in the global economy, these global flows of capital, and you're refusing to think about that, and instead you're focusing on this kind of small piece that's in front of you. So ultimately this kind of becomes more of an ethical or ethico-aesthetic discipline or discourse where this is mainly about showing your own kind of virtue rather than necessarily changing things on a systemic level. So his conclusion is that most of these policies are unlikely to be able to challenge the very global system which is responsible for generating the kind of bad effects that they criticise. And really he kind of diagnoses it as being indicative of a pessimism about our ability to effectively change things. So in lieu of the ability to change things, instead we're going to change our own habits, in a sense. And to return to the art world, again, has kind of tendencies towards presenting a kind of authenticity with things like site specificity, an engagement with place, but behind it a lot of the time are simply the kind of forces that we're all familiar with, the forces of the global art market, global capitalism, and increasingly kind of place marketing by leading cities that are trying to make themselves more appealing to tourists and others. So kind of the ideas of localism that are animating a lot of these different discourses are, I think, problematic. So some of them are problematic because they're an appealing cover for dubious politics, basically. So we know what to do with that, we just don't believe it. But if we want to have any idea of the local or want to kind of think about local, I think we need to rethink it. So we can't presume, I would argue, that simply operating at a local level will be sufficient for political, economic, or aesthetic benefits. The world is more complex than that. And ultimately, this is because it relies on a series of overly simple binaries. So, for example, global, local. Complex, simple, inauthentic, authentic. And kind of says that the local is the kind of good pole within these binaries. So what we need to do is we need to kind of rethink, well, what is going on, what's going on with localism itself? What's going on with the local? So one thing we might need to do is to distinguish between localism proper and decentralization. So we might think of decentralization, which is simply enabling decision-making to take place in less centralized fashion. That doesn't necessarily need to result in a kind of absolute localism. This could be a relative process. We need to avoid the naive presumption that the local is necessarily a zone of authenticity, political or aesthetic. It might be, it might not be. I mean, it offers no guarantees. But more broadly than this, we need to reconsider the spatial imaginary. So what is going on when we think about locality? So why is the local as much as what is the local? So why does the local emerge as a kind of spatial horizon? So one of the reasons which we might give is a kind of set of physical constraints. Physical or cognitive constraints given by the fact that we are human beings, we exist in a certain form, we have certain mental capacities. So to a certain extent, when we're talking about the local, it's a question of scale, and we exist at a determinate scale with particular kinds of physical sensory inputs, so certain senses that are able to perceive certain stimuli, certain abilities to act, and these are basically given by our bodies at some level. So you end up with a sort of scaling structure of nested localities emerges as soon as a human society spreads beyond the reach of an individual's immediate senses and limbs. You immediately end up with, well, some things are local to me and some things are non-local. So maybe the physical form is one way that we can think this. Another one is by cognitive constraints. So there's a very interesting theory by a guy called R.I.M. Dunbar, and he kind of wants to understand why it is that human communities end up locking in around certain numbers. So he came up with this idea called Dunbar's number, which is approximately 150 people. And his idea, and he did sort of anthropological surveys across a variety of, huge variety of different human cultures and occupations and locations around the globe. And he found that kind of the largest size of a kind of self-transparent human community, kind of without mediation, is around 150 people. So he theorizes that this is related to kind of what he calls human neocortex size. So it's certain elements within the brain mean that we're only able to kind of interact in a kind of transparent way with this number of people. So this number appears throughout a large number of different social forms, so like maximum class sizes to the sizes of tribes to sizes of battle groups and militaries. This becomes a kind of beyond that, things end up becoming more complicated. You know, it's hard to keep track of everybody beyond 150 people. So beyond Dunbar's number and outside the kind of spatio-temporal locality implied by the body, some kind of process of abstraction begins. So abstraction or mediation. Now, maybe one way around this is through technology. So we can go beyond such limits and constraints. So maybe this creates a different kind of understanding of what locality is, what the local is. So we can certainly interact beyond physical limits. We can have close friendship groups or even kind of like collaborative working with people from around the world very easily today. So we can create new complex localities that are unlimited by physical space. But also we can use technology to kind of better represent the world. So if part of the problem is the fact that we need better cognitive maps, we need a better way of thinking about what is our relationship between ourselves and these kind of very complex structural phenomena, then one way to do this would be to use technology. So there's ways of representing that we could avail ourselves of. So this would kind of move beyond our sensory limits. So it's very hard for us to experience, for example, I don't know, the global financial system, for example, would be very hard to experience you can't meet it in person. It's a kind of an emergent system created out of the interactions of millions of different entities, processes, technologies, human beings, interacting over time. But what you could do is you could come up with a way of representing it. So you could take inputs from a variety of different indices around the world related to global financial markets, and then you could run them through some kind of visualization. This is how people interact. This is how people, for example, market traders are able to interact with markets. It's because they have very expensive proprietary systems that are providing them with a series of easy-to-understand representational data. So this too might enable us to get beyond our kind of representational locality. There's also another question here. So there's outside of this kind of question of physical, cognitive constraints and the relative role of technology perhaps in addressing that. We also need to think in terms of political and economic issues. So this is the idea of the local as relative or absolute. So we kind of have a kind of preconceptual understanding of space as kind of geopolitical space as already kind of cut up into, for example, global, regional, national, local, and maybe other divisions. So these kind of imagine them pretty critically to be a kind of transcendental schema into which stuff falls. So this is at the regional level, this is at the local level, this is at the national level. But already with the idea of the national, you've got a kind of the national is not natural. This is the result of hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years of human contention of politics and economics and socio-cultural transformation, which has led us towards this idea of the nation state, for example, that we might think of localities in relationship to. So there are a large number of debates about exactly how we need to think about space and scaling. If we're going to be thinking about the local is normally in contrast to something larger, something more abstract, more general. So we can think about this in a number of ways. So there's been recent debates in kind of theoretical geography, which want to kind of complexify these. So you've got maybe absolute scale, relational scale. And maybe within absolute and relational scale, locality, globality would be different kinds of thing. There's also been people, for example, David Harvey argues that you can think about it as absolute scale, relative scale, and relational scale. Or you can say that there's simply a question of hierarchy. So these are kind of spatial hierarchies, local, global, and all the levels in between. And all of these are basically emerge from specific relationships. So, for example, you could have a kind of, perhaps a kind of a flat way of looking at this, which is these relationships are simply a matter of the particular set of actually existing causal relationships between these systems. There's no pre-existing scheme. So this would be the idea that kind of spatial hierarchies are going to be much more complex, knotty, multilateral than certainly a kind of preconceived schema, which kind of says that at a certain scale things lock in and we can conceive of them in a certain way, behaving in a certain way. And often we conceive of them as operating in a way where things of a similar scale only interact with things on that same scale. So there's an idea that kind of nations can only deal with nations, but this is clearly untrue. So we need to think this in practice. We need to think about the kinds of agents and systems that cross these linear barriers. So this would be the kind of, maybe there are some localities that are more intrinsically in touch with the global system than others. I mean, this seems to be definitely true. You can see certain power centers within elements of the global system which are clearly localities that are far more influential, causally influential on the rest of the global system than others. So here it's a kind of question of the production of space, the production of particular kinds of hierarchical interrelationships. So these are kind of generated out of processes of political, economic contention, socio-cultural contention. It's a question of the production of space. So the fact that we kind of conceive of locality in relationship to the kind of the regional and then in relationship to the national and beyond that into the global, this is all partly a question about the kind of the political economic setup, the way that we're kind of running the world. And maybe we could reimagine this in some way. So there's a final way that we can rethink the local. It's through kind of formal philosophical ideas. So this would be the idea, well, outside of kind of socio-cultural contention, outside the limits of our bodies, the limits of our kind of cognitive capacities, what is it that gives us this idea of global and local? What's the most general relationship of the kind of local horizon towards its global or universal container? So here maybe one way we can think about this is through the recent work of the philosopher Reza Negrestani and his reading of the American philosopher C.S. Peirce. And Negrestani is basically trying to think in the most abstract terms about what is it that gives us the local? What is it that gives us the global? What's the relationship between the two? So there's a very long, complicated explanation about how what he actually thinks about this. But it basically cashes out as it's the relationship between regional, localized horizons of the universal of what the philosopher C.S. Peirce calls the continuum. So he says there is only one world, it's utterly continuous. This is where everything is. All regional or localized horizons must be cut from this, the cloth of the continuum. In this very abstract, this is the kind of highest degree of abstraction. And because of this, Negrestani thinks that these kinds of cutouts, these bits that have been cut from an infinite continuity, have to be considered as less defined than we think. So this means that in their very nature they're indefinite, blurry, existing in a state of fusion, open both to other localities and remaining in relation to the global of the continuum. So in this very abstract sense, he argues, exteriority always maintains multiple pathways by which it might enter an interiorized horizon. So there's a less kind of static, maybe less hierarchized understanding about the relationship between the global and the local. And these potential pathways are all ways by which the exterior and more global can erupt into the local through vectors of trauma. So he's kind of thinking this in both a very abstract but also kind of Freudian kind of sense. And what this kind of leads to is a very high degree of formality, is to suggest that this kind of account of the global and the local points towards the fact that neither the local or the global is primary over the other necessarily. Rather, they're kind of mutually bound up with one another. where there is always a kind of potential for what he calls perforation, transplantation, transition, and that maybe there isn't this kind of straightforward, hierarchized sense of the global, the local, and the regional. So, in conclusion, we need to complexify our understanding of the local. So we can think of it we can do this in a number of ways. So rather than just coming up with a kind of small is beautiful heuristic to guide our action, instead we need to kind of return to thinking about, well, why does locality exist at all? And what does this mean for the way that we're going to think about problems, the way we're going to think about how we're going to respond to problems, the way we're going to think about what works, what doesn't work, the way we're going to think about the kind of aesthetic valency of the local as well. So I've suggested a few of these ways. So we should think about physical and cognitive constraints, and we should also think about the way that technology can expand them or manipulate them, transform them. Not just technology, but also techniques. You can consider the electoral systems, for example, as a system, as a kind of technology which enables us to have kind of national level governments. We might not think it's a very good technology, maybe think of ways that we would transform it for the better, but these are technologies which enable us to get beyond the local, to attain a kind of degree of abstraction in terms of the way we govern. We can also think about it as being formed out of particular kind of political processes, so particular ways that hierarchies emerge within the kind of geopolitical system. And we can also think about it in this kind of formalized way. But taken together, these give us the tools to shift away from the sort of naive ideological idea that the local is good. The local is just kind of intrinsically good. So this leads us towards a kind of maybe more critical way of thinking about it. And also a way that might lead us towards a kind of more effective understanding about how we could act within the world. What the relationship between the global and the local might be. Which localities in particular. And maybe an interesting example of this in a kind of artistic context has come recently. The artist Matt Dryhurst has recently produced a platform which is kind of an interesting way of thinking about how we could come up with a kind of more nuanced idea of site specificity in an age of kind of technical systems. So Dryhurst's idea is basically, if you're an artist online, so if you produce any kind of embeddable content, it's basically, he's come up with a platform called Saga. And this platform enables you to, on a case-by-case basis, modify how this content is presented. So, for example, if you produce a kind of embeddable content and it gets taken up by some site that you don't like, you can scroll across it remotely, fuck you, or any other kind of commentary you might like. You could prevent it entirely. You can kind of come up with various ways of monetizing it through this platform. So it's a kind of site specificity, but it's a different kind of site specificity. It's not wedded to this idea of the kind of a kind of purely authentic local, which has a kind of absolute specificity to it, and instead is thinking about how, in the kind of modern technical environment, the local is always relative, in some sense. Okay, but I'll finish now. Thank you.
I'm going to show. Let me just show you the Matt Dryhurst piece, because I know it quite well.
I should have embedded it.
It's fine. I can just do it. So this is a journal called Accessions. Oops, that's not spelled right. Which came out of so this is a journal called Accessions, which came out of the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College last year. And Matt's piece is here. So if you do accessions.org, people already started working on it. This is a video which will not play now because of the software we have. But you can see that like this would be an image, this thing here would be an image that would be made by someone, an artist or whomever, which would go up on a website or be used by somebody else on a Twitter feed or on a Flickr or however it gets used. You could then, if you found this, you could then intervene on that image, okay, using something on a GitHub, using the Saga. This is another one. Right. So you go to GitHub.
It's been released now.
Yeah.
It's come out. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, this was the release of it. And you can basically use the mechanism, which I don't understand, but I'm sure it works very well, to just do this stuff with your own images. So basically, I think that the idea is that you have the image on your own site, somebody else appropriates it for their site through an embed, and then you can sort of specify what happens to the image on the other site, but not your own site. Okay, so you end up with this kind of running commentary on how your image is being employed on other sites, and that could end up with, as you were saying, like monetizing the scheme.
Yeah.
So in Matt's description of it here, he has, let me see, yeah. So for Tumblr teens in the UK, only make the first 500 plays free, and then have it dramatically self-destruct or replaced with a video of cattle grazing. Okay, so it kind of gives control for people's production on a system or a mode of circulation which currently there isn't control over the use of images. The only thing you can do at the moment is issue a takedown notice, but of course, like that's hard to use, and actually isn't a very effective or inventive way of dealing with other people's use of your imagery. Right? So accessions.org. I'd also recommend the rest of the journal because we spend a lot of time editing it, just no other reason. Okay, we only have one mic today. We only have. What? Is that what? No. Okay, I'll just working out. Was it? Okay. Can you get it to work? No, I'll just shout. We have one mic, a number of sex toy-looking objects, which we'll try not to. Maybe we will use. I don't know. I think they're really boring. We'll start working with these. So I'm going to. It was a really clear talk, so thank you for that. It's very welcome. I'm going to ask what it is. I'm going to ask one or two questions. I think because it was clear, you probably have a number of responses. I don't know what's going on. It's around. I get the general move around the local in a way is a retreat from the complexity of the global, right? So any politics or social formation, artistic practice that bases itself or says that localism is like the virtuous thing to do or the basis of the practice, in a way, it's good for the people who are doing it and subscribe to it, but it has to be understood that this is an inadequate politics for the conditions that we're in, generally speaking, right? So it's partly like it's a smug fest essentially, where the people who are advocating and endorsing their own particular localism feel good and righteous that they're not participating in the bad system, which is abstract and global. But it's only those people who get anything from it. Everyone else is just left to fend for themselves. So that's the criticism, and you can sort of see this in the 100-mile diet in a way, which of course is a diet that only very, very few people, privileged people, can do, because you need expensive. You need a lot of money to kind of pay for the local food.
But also, it doesn't even necessarily work. So there's been kind of there's a DEFRA study done recently. It basically said that if your aim is trying to save the environment, it's not necessarily the best metric. So it could be that because you need to take into account all of the carbon emissions, the complete energy usage for a given product. So if you're talking about bananas, for example, then maybe you could grow them in this country and you wouldn't have to transport them very far to supermarkets in this country. But maybe it would cost you a lot of energy because it's not necessarily maybe the best weather conditions for it. So So it doesn't. It's not really necessary. And often, if you look at the kind of the factor of transportation costs in any given the total amount of carbon used or energy used for a given product, often transportation is not that high. It doesn't even necessarily work on its kind of merits.
Right. So if we get away from the, as you said at the end, get away from the naive idea that the local is automatically a good. I guess I have a question, I suppose, based on the 100-mile diet as an example. In a way, what you can do with localism is assure yourself that you're doing something politically good. One of the difficulties with complexity is that whatever move you make, it's always compromised and partial and also somewhat ineffective, right? But in a different way, because you can never act comprehensively on an abstraction or a global order, or even really, unless you're in the center of power, you can't really act on a national scale. So in a way, I guess the issue is if the motivation against localism is a kind of political motivation about finding the right scale to work on to address systemic problems rather than one's own sort of narcissistic gratification or something. What am I trying to ask? I guess it's something like, what's the assurance that could be put in place that the politics you have are a good politics, right? I mean, let me give an example of it through the art system. So if you do kind of kind of site-specific work or a practice about like the community you're in or the artists or wherever, that's fine. It's good for those people, and you can kind of say like, yeah, screw the art markets and screw freeze and blah blah blah. It's all that's all a nonsense, and you demonstrate that by refusing to enter those mechanisms, right? Through kind of, in the old days it'd been the alternative space or the artist project space and so on. If for example that gets taken up by a curator, for example, and gets put into an institutional space like the Tate, it's immediately compromised. Okay, in those terms of a localism, but somehow, like the argument presenting would necessarily commit you to operating in institutions like the Tate, because those are operating at the level of national and international circulation, reputation, and so on and so forth, right? So on the one hand, you're endorsing that larger scale operation, because that's the way to get out of the problem of localism. But the political form you take and the political content can't be as assured in the kind of statement that it's making, or the ambition that it's trying to realise.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So I mean, I guess the kind of what I would say is that the kind of assurances that people are kind of finding, be it aesthetic assurances or political or economic assurances, depending on what kind of thing we're talking about. We're talking about, for example, doing some kind of very community-focused or otherwise site-specific artwork or art project. Then, I mean, it may well be that this is, this, depending on what your objectives are. So let's say your objectives are to get outside of the kind of corruptions of the global art market and the global art kind of system. Then maybe, maybe this will have, maybe at least for you and the participants, there might be some benefits. But depending on what it is, it may well still be secretly funded by that self-same system, depending on what it is. So then you were saying, okay, but doesn't this then kind of obligate you to kind of, you need to be at the centre, you need to be in these kind of command centres within this system. So this would be, the Tate and various other kind of global-facing institutions. And I think, well, I mean, partially, I guess it kind of does. It says that depending on what you want, so if all you're interested in is evading the kind of structural problem and sort of bunkering down somewhere where you're going to feel virtuous because you're not involved in it, then that's one thing. That's probably possible to do that. I think it changes somewhat if you're thinking about how would you change this. If you view this as genuinely deleterious, if you think that the kind of the global function of art is threatened by the kind of economic forces which are shaping it, the economic and institutional forces that are shaping it, and you want to address that, then I think, you need to think about, you probably wouldn't be trying to work inside these institutions, but this then obviously brings you back to all of the kind of traditional problems of institutional critique, in the way that, any time I speak to somebody at the Tate, they're always saying, yeah, when I got here, I was going to change everything, and now it's all falling apart, and I just want to leave. So maybe this kind of the pole of the very biggest institution and the kind of completely going off grid. These are two kinds of extremes. I think you have to say that one individual going into any of these kind of large institutions is not likely to be able to change it. One good individual is simply going to be converted via the system, via the kind of structural imperatives and rewards towards replicating what that structure kind of already thinks is good. So you kind of, if you're thinking about a genuinely systemic problem, then you would probably need to think about it in a beyond yourself, I think, beyond your own actions. So you need to think about, what are the various kind of like horizons of action that could be achieved in a more kind of collective way? But that's a very, very difficult problem. Probably no more difficult than in the thinking about how you transition the art world. This is partially why you have your own arguments as to why we're not even going to bother doing that. We're just going to exit.
We'll do it without another day. Yes, that's for another day. I guess just to follow up on that, and I've got one more question about representation, and I'll throw it out. I guess the issue is, if you don't know, Alex is a co-author of the Manifesto for Accelerationist Politics, leading proponent of left accelerationism and so on and so forth. We can look at that later online. Now, if the argument of left accelerationism, I don't know if you want to go back to this. I take the work you're doing now to be a development and a kind of fleshing out of what was presented in very rudimentary form in the manifesto. But the argument of the Manifesto for Accelerationist Politics was, in a way, if capitalism is a problem, and it is a problem, we accept that, and it needs transformation, and we need to exit or kind of get out of the capitalist model, you need to do that in a systemic way rather than to save your own souls in a way, because that's always going to be a very small number of people who can do it, and localism doesn't do anything for anyone else. Particularly, it might present a model, but because of the problems of translation or transportability, the model can't always just be adapted somewhere else. So the issue is like, if you the Tate is an extreme example. The more common example would be something like a biennial, all right, or something in a kind of smaller scale exhibition venue, which kind of is kind of tucked into international networks, not necessarily art networks like the Zabludovic connection, which is tied in, of course, into art networks, but all other kinds of networks as well, which supports local, like what's happening in London now. Right? So localism is kind of presented as a showcase for other circuits. The issue is, once you enter those circuits, you're immediately politically compromised, of course. So the question is, how do you hold on to the program or the ambition, given the compromises that one's inevitably caught up in? I mean, sorry, in a practical way, not just as a sort of suffering soul at the Tate kind of model.
Yeah, and I think this is why you need to have a kind of like an understanding about, so what's your theory of change? So what would change look like? Rather than thinking about it as, if enough good people end up going to an institution, they might be able to change it. So you need to think kind of at various different scales about where are the kind of key points of transition, where at every given stage, what's my kind of capacity for action? So the kind of way that I think about this increasingly is through this idea of hegemony. So this bears a lot of explanation. We probably don't have time to get into it fully, but in this kind of sense, you'll be looking at the hegemony of a certain way of funding and conceptualizing the art world.
Just outline what hegemony is.
So hegemony is basically a system of power. It's a system of power which is largely, but not entirely, based around diffuse forms of behaviour modification and leadership, which take diverse forms. So you can have, some of these are going to relate to the kind of choice architectures that are given by certain structural conditions. Some are going to be given by particular kind of ways that we frame the world. It's often what gets called common sense. So our common sense or ideology. So what, the kind of mental furniture by which we frame the world, if you are able to change that, there's various mechanisms which we are aware of which give us influence over that, then you can change the way that people conceive of problems and therefore conceive of themselves, conceive of action. There's also a variety of other stuff that goes into it. But you can consider kind of hegemony as a kind of an emergent form of power, so it emerges out of a lot of different lower level interactions. So in the kind of art world, you can think about, well, what is it that maintains its present condition? So a large, so some of this is kind of structural organisation. So it's the way that certain networks are configured, in a sense, and this might be particular social networks, institutions, the set of relationships between them, the kind of career pathways for kind of key, the kind of the privileged players within this world. So this might be the kind of where are all of the key curators? What's their background? What institutions have they come through? What's this pathway they've gone down? What about the artists? What's their So this gives you already a kind of an understanding of, well, here are some of the key nodes within this system. These are the kind of things that are shaping all the participants, the powerful participants in this system. And so for a large part, you can kind of think, well, there's going to be certain kind of educational institutions, there's going to be certain ways that people are kind of conceiving of things. There's also a certain set of kind of less diffuse, more kind of material kind of constraints. This is the money issue, right? So it's where is all this money coming from? And as we know, it's kind of coming from some less dubious sources and some very, very dubious sources, as we were discussing the other evening, in terms of where some money within the art world is coming from. It's either literal money laundering or kind of figurative, ethical money laundering from various dubious companies and pursuits. So you need to kind of think, well, okay, so there's a financial hegemony here, and this is kind of proceeding on the basis of the fact that all of these this is how this system is being lubricated through all these funding streams. There's also a set of kind of common sense ideas, mental filters that people are using, and these come through various kind of educational systems, through various institutional systems. And what you would need to do is, to think about, so how else can where would we be getting this? Do we need this money? If we do need this money, then where would we be getting it from if it wasn't from these sources, and the kind of deleterious effect that they have? Certain systems of kind of very wealthy collectors or kind of giant Japanese banks buying artwork, probably not good, kind of arms manufacturers and oil companies laundering their money through sponsoring big institutional art spaces is probably not good. But what are the alternative options? But then you'll quickly see that some of these issues are not just art world issues. They're actually issues about the kind of the way the entire world operates, in a sense, which is unsatisfactory, because where we thought we were just going to try and reform the art world, it turns out that a lot of what's wrong with the art world is what's wrong with the world. So it turns out that actually it's the kind of, the preponderance of a particular kind of socio-economic model, maybe. So there isn't enough public funding, so we have to, the art world starts to have oil companies and arms manufacturers being involved in it. You can also maybe say this is a kind of, a problem with kind of broader ways around which we kind of conceive of things. So this quickly becomes a more difficult problem, but not an entirely intractable problem, I think. But it's something where we need to think about what are the exact mechanisms which we're reproducing this. What's our degree of influence? Where do we need to get to in order to sort of begin to have the capacity to act, to change that? And if we do that successfully, what does this open up beyond that?
Okay.
Slightly longer.
Yeah, I just maybe you want to come back to that in the questions. I have one more around representation, and it was your argument that in a way one of the ways to move between scales, or to turn large scale or kind of more than human scale systems and objects into something that one can act on, is through modes of representation. So in a way, what you're proposing is an affirmation of representation as doing work to produce the kind of a kind of challenging politics that gets out of the problem of scale of localism, which doesn't take scaling up seriously enough or as a condition of whatever politics needs to happen. So it gets out of localism, but also it doesn't just surrender into a kind of meh kind of condition of like it's too the scale is just too big, we can't do anything at all. It ends up with a sort of atomization. Now, what interests me around your affirmation I'll call it an affirmation of representation or endorsement, anyway, of representation as a viable political strategy. This is quite counter to standard claims within the art system following society's spectral critique, right? So in the art system, representation is always something, and this is also a given of post-structuralist political theory, that representation is something to be held in suspicion, because it's distorting, it's manipulative, it's a power mechanism which doesn't declare itself as such. And what we should do in art is to be critical of representation by challenging it, putting questions to it, not endorsing it, right? Just to kind of put a pause on it or hesitate. And so a lot of contemporary art spends its time saying, no, representation isn't going to do the work that we need to do to have the politics that we want. The politics that we want has to come through a critical relationship to representation, per se, right? But the politics you're proposing seems just to say, like, if we continue to be caught up in the problem of asking questions to representation, continually finding it inadequate, never kind of accepting that representation can do worthwhile work, we won't actually be able to meet the systemic conditions that we need to meet in order to kind of construct politics that doesn't just go back to the local.
Yeah, I think that's largely right, but I think also there's kind of maybe a slightly false dichotomy there, because I think you can maintain a critical attitude to representation that you don't see it's just totally kind of transparent and operative perfectly. But at the same time, I think you can still identify it as necessary to some extent, or that it has, for all of its kind of inevitable flaws, that if you kind of want to kind of come up with a sort of an aesthetics or a politics outside of it, where you're interested in addressing the complex, the global, these can only be understood, or they can only be kind of conceptualized through a representational schema, basically. So if you think about, I don't know, climate change, for example. So the kind of the favourite retort of global warming deniers is to say, well, it's all based on models, and the models might be wrong, because they're not experiments. It's not the classic kind of scientific method. So we've not done experiments on it. We don't actually know. This is just a computer model, and I think most of us hopefully will be aware of why that's kind of a problem. It is just a computer model, but it's the best. It's one of the only ways that we're actually able to think about, well, how is it that these changes that we've seen empirically, how are they going to translate in the future? And so in this kind of case, you can have a critique of representation. You can say these models are always speculative. They are always speculative, and so they are always built with certain presumptions, and these presumptions might be wrong. But at the same time, you can see them for all of their fallibility as a kind of way that we can think and interact with what otherwise would be irreducibly complex. So if you think about the climate system, there's so many different feedback loops between different subsystems. So even something as simple as the ice caps, for example. So beyond a certain point in the ice caps melt, it changes the reflectivity of the entire globe, and this means that we absorb even more, becomes an accelerator beyond a certain point. So there's various tipping points. And working out where all these are, how they work, what their interactions are, is massively complex. So it's highly likely that a lot of the models aren't accurate. But that's not what they're supposed to, it's not necessarily what they're supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be guiding action. And so, they're operating as a kind of a framework in which we can think about something that otherwise we couldn't think about. So it's not the case that I think we need to be we want to go back to being critical about the issue of representation. I think we should still be critical, but we should identify it for what it is, for what it enables us to do, and also identify the costs of what happens if you get rid of it. If you get rid of it, you're kind of groping in the dark, even though before you were kind of maybe viewing the world through distorted lenses. If you can identify the fact that they are likely to be distorted, it will still give you a vision of the world, which otherwise you would be unable to achieve. I think this is, that is significant. And I think the idea that you can completely have done with representation, that our only attitude to it should be kind of critical, is problematic, especially if you're thinking about any kind of issue beyond a certain scale, I think it's inevitable you have to have recourse to it.
All right. Questions? I see one there. Sorry, just before you start, as usual, I'll paraphrase the question when you finish.
I'm interested in kind of this critique of localism and the local and also its relation to accelerationism, which you mentioned. I guess from my understanding, localism is more about efficient use of local resources, and kind of I'm pretty aware of like you said, that kind of romantic virtuosity that surrounds it, but I think there actually is a lot of validity to the reasoning behind that. And I'm wondering, in your argument, you kind of almost, you say that kind of your intention is that we need to complexify this idea of localism, but I think that with this idea of accelerationism and using our resources properly to accelerate beyond capitalism, etc., I wonder if there's actually a lot of benefit that we can take from localism, but perhaps just not glorifying it to the point of making, like, harvesting bananas in Britain, but still actually taking advantage of the resources that are here in Britain and capitalizing on that. So.
All right. So the question is, if I can paraphrase, localism is not bad.
Yeah.
Is there something in it that could be used towards the kind of politics that you're interested in?
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. I mean, this is the kind of way I wanted to make a distinction between a kind of absolute localism where you kind of get stuck at the level of the local as your complete kind of horizon of action, and instead thinking about maybe decentralization without the local as this kind of ultra-privileged sphere. So in that kind of sense, I guess I would agree, would say that basically, yeah, of course there's benefits to kind of, for example, not just in terms of resources, but then in terms of resources, you need kind of local, regional, global linkages. You need a kind of a system of bridging beyond the local to actually think, well, beyond what this individual community needs, well, what do these other ones need, and how can all of these different needs be put into interaction with one another? And I guess today, kind of like the market performs this role, and it does this role quite successfully to some extent, but also with inevitable huge failures. For example, all of the kind of externalities that are ignored by market relationships. We can also think about this in terms of kind of like democracy as well. So the kind of representational systems, in the sense of representational government that we have today in, for example, this country, are incredibly useless. They're really kind of antediluvian. They're sort of I don't know, like 18th century techniques, when we're all used to a world of kind of hyper interactivity via digital networks. Why can't we bring that to kind of enable decentralization in a way which is not just going to be us sitting in a room debating with people for 90% of our time? Why can't we do this through a kind of more effective set of technologies? So I think this is definitely true. There are kind of real benefits to localism, providing that you don't kind of buy into the full localist gospel, which says that small is always beautiful and that the local is always authentic. So I think as long as you don't kind of buy into that, I think it's the local horizon of action, obviously, is generally the way in which we perceive the world, but it needs to be put into contact. So even in terms of kind of the issue about how do we portion energy usage, I think one of the ways that we need to do that, it's not going to be as simple as just food miles. It's going to be a question of the total lifespan, energy, resources needed for this given item. So for example, a lot of electric cars, or at least a few years ago maybe this has been improved, a lot of them, while they don't use oil, so they obviously, at least at the point of the automotive unit itself, they're not outputting that much carbon. A lot of them actually, in terms of the whole life cycle of the product, use more carbon. They were more energy intensive to make than other cars. They're more complicated. So partially we need to kind of get a kind of non-local systems that are going to be able to judge this stuff better than you and I can. I mean, I don't want to have to work out for every single product what's going to be the best kind of most energy efficient usage. You want this to be, you want kind of a group of experts to do that. That would be, a better use of everybody's time.
Okay. Carl?
Hi. I kind of want to follow up from that question in a way, in terms of your, I don't know, I guess kind of assumption about left-wing localist activism. I guess I'm speaking specifically about kind of a few, specific examples. Like, so I'm going to be local because that's the thing. So I'm from Sussex, and the village Balcombe there that are process fracking. Just everyone doesn't know one, and it's kind of amazing because Balcombe's this very privileged, wealthy village with its British idyll, and then as the boundaries of extraction get closer to that privilege, all of a sudden everyone's like, oh god, this is bad. And then obviously the kind of direct protest against that succeeded. We don't have fracking in Balcombe, and through technology, this kind of networked localism, you've now got this network of people, Irish, British, Scottish, etc., anti-fracking localisms, sharing that locality and preparing for and making legible the crimes of now, etc. And this extends, all over the world. You've got, gold mines in Greece, blah blah blah, indigenous struggles in Canada and stuff. And so I guess my question is, in this binary between local and global, I see that kind of locality not as a dumbing down, not as a retreat. It is a retreat, but it's a retreat into legibility. It's a retreat out of the fog of horror that is, contemporary capitalism, into looking at the material waste of that system in the legible local, and through networks, through communication, being able to use localism as a weapon, not as a kind of future model, not as a kind of eco-consumer future model alternative, but certainly in this stage of reconstruction, which actually I think is certainly not fast enough, but I see everywhere. I see the system kind of crumbling. Maybe I'm naive, not optimistic. And I think that to label localism as just complicit on that level, I know you've made some distinctions, but I think that local activism is actually very well equipped in not buying into these universalisms. Sorry, I've gone on there, but that's kind of, sorry, that's not a question. Can sum up to
All right. So through the example of anti-fracking in southeast and not so far from here, Carl was making the point that basically the protests against fracking were made by local communities who sort of, or town, which saw sort of fracking coming in across its border, and this kind of this motivated the town to kind of like set up an anti-fracking politics, which was successful, which is then in communication with anti-fracking activists elsewhere. So this is a model in which localism isn't parochial, or doesn't have. How did you put it? You said it's not a retreat from legibility.
It comes with education.
It's a kind of educated model which deals with what would otherwise be what you called capitalism's fog of horror, which is kind of nice. Thank you, Carl. So in a way, localism is a way to construct an activism in relationship to forces that are much larger, right, and abstract.
Yeah, I think this is a really good point. I think it's kind of maybe in some respects points the way towards a kind of more enlightened localism that isn't kind of stuck at the level of kind of ethical consumerism. I think, so for example, this idea about using communication as a kind of weapon, the communication between localities, they're no longer really quite localities in that sense, to kind of enable bridging between different kind of localised political movements, to kind of share knowledge on strategies and all this kind of stuff. This is very interesting. And I think there's a kind of broader question around what do we do to kind of not just get rid of fracking in each individual place where it's attempted, but to take it off the agenda altogether, for example. And this is obviously the objective. So this would, obviously, you need some local successes to start with, this is obviously essential. So the ability to kind of fight back fracking in Balkan is fantastic. The ability to join up with other people who've gone through similar experiences and other sort of regions and localities is important. But then the question is kind of how do you shift that to the next kind of stage? How do we kind of transform the kind of the presumption at the level of basically government that, you know, we need fracking is great, fracking doesn't do any harm, it'll be good for our, you know, reduce our energy imports and all this kind of stuff. So this then kind of, I mean, in terms of this kind of localism, I think like this localism is great. There's always a question about how do we scale this? How do we begin to, because otherwise you're kind of left, you know, every time there's another kind of, fracking site has been kind of opened up. Do we just defend each time? You need to work out how to get away from that, or to bridge from beginning with that and successfully defending towards going on a kind of offensive to basically change people's minds on a kind of national, regional, global level about the kind of the fact that fracking is potentially dangerous and probably in the round definitely not worth pursuing as a policy. So then it's a question about how can you kind of move from these kind of network local politics towards a kind of, you know, an ability to transform the kind of national level set of, for example, the way the media frames these issues. So certainly some of these local successes have had a real effect already in terms of changing the kind of perhaps quite naive kind of conversation around it. But thinking about how this can be scaled up and how more localities can be brought in, and also how the kind of things which are identifying the kind of the mechanisms which are generating fracking in the first place. So, you know, working out exactly. So and working out how to remove the kind of things which they're drawing on for their power. So this would be kind of the kind of combating it in the media, working out who the people are operating there, thinking about who's funding it, and which particular MPs are going to be funded, how to change kind of like all of the kind of the planning laws and all this kind of stuff. And this would kind of put it on a more long-term basis to transition from a kind of presumption of the Tory government, which is basically fracking is good because we need hydrocarbons, energy, to a kind of presumption that it's generally dangerous.
Can I just do a quick follow-up? I know there's a question of this. Just a quick follow-up on that. Like the scale that you're saying the work needs to happen. It can't be. It's got to be collective work, right? Like the forms of representation that you're saying are important are sort of institutionally produced. The kind of activism that's needed and representations made to corporations, government, and so on has to take place globally, right? It's like fracking is a problem. I mean, it's certainly a problem within one country, but it's led by multinational corporations. So, in other words, a kind of collectivization presumed in the form of politics that you're demanding, but it's not a collectivization that's constituted through localism. So, what's the kind of mechanism for like large-scale collectivization?
Well, I mean, it can totally be constituted out of. Obviously, needs to begin with the local. It needs to begin with people understanding this issue in exactly this kind of sense. But I think it needs to move towards forms of organisation that are going to be able to transform the kind of the conditions of possibility for this particular policy. So you could think about transforming the kind of particular kind of this is kind of blocks at the kind of national level. How do we transform the regulatory environment so that fracking is no longer presumed to be a good thing? It's no longer going to be allowed except in kind of exceptional circumstances. So this involves like a kind of using the kind of the organisations and the kind of enthusiasm that people get from these kind of particular local victories and applying it to work out how we don't just have to continually defend and we can actually change the kind of conditions of possibility in which this terrible policy is being articulated.
But in the cultural space, it means understanding cultural practice as a hegemonic operator, right? So instead of I mean, again, I think the convention in contemporary art, which is not in fact the case, but is the discourse that we have, is that we should be sort of challenging hegemonic operation. We should be kind of pulling back from it, questioning it, in a way never becoming ourselves hegemonic operators, and those people that are have to be treated with suspicion because they're part of the global mechanism. But in a way, the model you're requiring, in a way, cultural practice can play a really important part in this, because it's through Gramsci, whose model it is, the hegemon as a non-coercive sort of common sense changing mechanism takes place through culture primarily, right?
This is one way to read Gramsci. Yeah, he's certainly very interested in culture. He was interested in the way that, particularly kind of education and also kind of our understandings about our kind of sense of. He's very interested in the kind of national popular, but he was writing in the kind of 1930s, so the kind of the idea of nationalism is obviously a very key kind of part of the political imaginary at that point. But I think it's just to return to the kind of the thing you were talking about at the start. So there's an idea in kind of contemporary art discourse that says hegemony is bad. We need to undo hegemony. And this is a kind of this is a certain way of understanding power. It's an idea that kind of what we want is kind of a form of freedom that we can only obtain by getting rid of power, and that then we'll be all right because the power won't exist. We've escaped power. But the understanding of kind of like the perspective of hegemony is basically that you are almost never outside of power. You can't. There's no way out. You're always going to be within a system which is sculpting your behaviour. It's influencing you in ways that you can understand and maybe you can't understand. It's generating the kind of the set of choices that you perceive that are the way that you understand your orientation to the world. It's shaping the way that you kind of understand issues. So all of this means that instead of thinking you can get outside of hegemony, instead, even ironically, the idea that the aim of critical art practice or kind of art theory or art discourse should be to criticise existing hegemonies, and rather than generating new ones, is itself a hegemonic discourse. It's the common sense of the art world. So it kind of has this bizarre kind of self-undermining quality to it. But I think the interesting thing is that if you can't get outside of it, then you have to think about, well, how do we intervene in it, and how do we supplement one system of influence with one that was going to be a system of influence that we agree with. So rather than saying that kind of power is a system that we can escape from, that there are escape routes, that there are exit strategies from power, basically as long as you have human sociality, there will be systems of power. So how do we get to a system of power which is not going to be deleterious? How is it a system of power which is not oppressive, reactionary, exploitative? So then this kind of becomes a question of, well, how do we begin to intervene in this, which is a very complicated question. One which basically I think is needs to be insisted on, because the kind of implication of kind of the art world discourse, which says we need to critique hegemonies. This is true. We need to critique the existing kind of modes of power, but we need to think about how we can. What do we want? And then once we've understood at least partially what we want, how are we going to produce what we want as a system, as a better system for kind of influencing human behaviour. So the kind of the real issue here is to basically begin to think about what we want, how we're going to get there, and this begins with kind of criticism necessarily. But I think the idea that you can escape it, this is kind of part of the problem with localism. I think in a sense, this kind of absolutised localism. It's just this idea that there are certain horizons in which can be in a certain sense that can escape this kind of global systems and the global systems of power, and that we can, in different ways. So maybe in kind of Cameron's big society, we're all going to be helping out instead of having the state pay for everything. Or in more kind of left and interesting politics, it's the idea that we're going to create a small kind of self-transparent community in which everything will be debated. And this is an idea that you've minimised you've escaped the relationships of power. But kind of my argument is that you don't. You cannot. Instead, what you can do is you can achieve positions where you can re-engineer them within certain regions, and this can be for better or worse purposes, basically.
Okay. Can I see how many more people want? There's quite a number of questions. Let's just, because it's Alex is running. We've worked him hard. I'm going to just go round, pick up 3 questions I see, and so start there, and then John, and then the question at the end. Is anyone else? I missed anyone else out? And then a fourth one here. So we'll just go down this line and then up to you. All right? Okay, go ahead.
Yes, my question is, so how can we scale our leftist human organization without falling into the trap of bureaucracy, which you criticize as a negative aspect of right-wing localism?
Is that it?
That's it.
Oh, mwah, thank you. Okay.
We're
good.
taking all of them.
Yeah, we'll take them all. Okay, next.
Completely sympathise with the critique of localism, but your prognosis sounds purely tactical. And I wondered if that's, so all the discourse of kind of sculpting choice sounds like, well, that's Blair's discourse, but you turned it to your agenda. So it sounds as if you're saying, I accept that that's the right tactic, but I'm going to address it to different aims. So I wondered if that's, if there's some other dimension to this. Is there a strategy you're not giving us within the tactical approach, or is it that you think the tactical approach is the only one?
I'll go through these at the end. So
I just wondered about if you thought about this being described as being sort of neo-modernist, because it feels almost like certain things you're describing, like Marinity or even some vorticism, certain ideas. I just wondered if that sort of come up at any stage.
your question. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't hear you so well, so I'm not but just because you're talking about how it's narcissistic for people to engage in, how kind of there's a narcissism in people engaging in localism and then activism, but I'm also thinking about whether there's a danger in this kind of politics also triggering a kind of narcissism where we can say that nothing is going to have any impact anyways, so we might as well just buy our exotic fruits in the supermarket anyways because it's not going to actually do anything. And then also the fact that it gets very technical as soon as, so kind of the things you're proposing, I perceive them as being quite technical and kind of opposed in that sense to like the left-wing local politics that I know of, and how would you seek to resolve that problem that it then gets very technical and not everyone can necessarily engage in these kinds of things like creating technologies to make things more accessible, because that's a very specialized kind of thing to do.
Okay. All right. In fairness, narcissism was my word and not Alex's.
Yeah, so just there was a general
okay.
sense.
All right. So I'll just take that question again. So the issue was if there's a criticism made by me, not Alex, that localism is a narcissism, there's a countervailing one on the part of the kind of, I'll call it left accelerationist sort of politics. That on the one hand, there's a kind of sense that this is far too large a system for me to do anything, and so you end up just falling back into private consumption patterns as where you enact your politics. And secondly, the issue would be that the kind of abstractions that Alex is propounding require technical expertise, and that's excluding. Right? So the questions of access and how do you construct a kind of larger scale political configuration if it's that exclusive and so on. The question here was about whether any of the work that Alex is interested in has been described as neo-modernist, or if it is neo-modernist. The question from John was whether Alex is describing a bunch of tactics in that these are ways of doing a politics, but sort of the tactical interventions are quite common from kind of in Britain a New Labour discourse, or in America with a kind of Blue Democrat discourse or practice. So what is Alex's or left acceleration strategy? What is this? What are these reorganizations of political endeavour directed towards? And then the first question was, in a way, comes back to the issue of technicality, which was that the kind of political formations you're arguing for, because they're complex and large scale, require bureaucracies, and that's the problem with right-wing politics, which I think is kind of touched back in.
Okay, good. Okay, so to turn to the first of these, kind of issue of does a kind of politics beyond a kind of interpersonal scale, does it require bureaucracy? Maybe not bureaucracy, but some form of administration. So there's, in any complex organisation beyond a certain scale, It requires forms of keeping track of what's going on. It requires sort of particular kind of communications systems.
But that's a political problem, isn't it?
Yeah, this is okay. So this is a political problem, but there's a question mark. So administration or bureaucracy is not necessarily bad. We're all of us are kind of at the end of a long sort of process of the critique of bureaucracy and the critique of these kind of anti-systemic movements that I mentioned in the talk. This is this idea that kind of bureaucracy, hierarchy, and organisation even as such are kind of problems that we're kind of sick of, and that we want this kind of libertarian escape or freedom from them. And this gets kind of digested, this kind of originates on the left, but gets digested by certain kind of neoliberal politics. It kind of, where they return to this kind of Hayekian idea about the impossibility of planning. The fact that we can't have socialism because it's impossible to have socialism because no single person can plan effectively. So we must rely on these kind of abstract, non-personal mechanisms. This is stuff like the market is a cognitive system that creates decisions, but no one can fully understand it. Okay, so this is the kind of the problem with bureaucracy. So I'd say we're at the end of this kind of ideological process, so we kind of think, yeah, bureaucracy is kind of immediately bad. I think it depends. I mean, I think it depends on what are you talking about. There's an idea that bureaucracy is bad, but at the same time, we all like the idea that the organisations we deal with know who we are, have a record of who we are, so that we don't. Also, that for example, everything doesn't have to be completely ad hoc. I mean, there's a question mark over, exactly, and there's various kind of ways to understand kind of bureaucracy, the relationship between administration and bureaucracy and kind of social complexity. So there's an idea that kind of beyond a certain scale, you inevitably begin to have kind of organisational problems that can't be just resolved through ad hoc mechanisms. So you need to come up with institutionalised mechanisms. And there's various critiques of bureaucracy, and a lot of which are very accurate, but there's always a question mark over, well, if you want to live in a complex society that isn't just a village on its own, in some respect, then some degree of bureaucracy is necessary. So then it's a question over, well, what does it do? How effective is it? Is it dehumanising bureaucracy, or is it actually helpful to our kind of operations? So I would say we're at the end of a very long critique of bureaucracy, but I would say that the consequences of not having any are not necessarily always elaborated. As much as I, on a personal level, of course, despise bureaucracy every time I kind of experience it, as I'm sure we all do. Okay, so question number 2. Prognosis is tactical, is this Blair? This kind of sounds like, choice architecture sounds like Blair. So there's a kind of question mark over really, there's 2 questions there. What's your strategy in place? Is it just tactics? Is there a game plan? And secondly, are the tactics just the same as what everybody else uses? So I think it's important to realise that working out how existing power works and then thinking about the mechanisms by which it is operative is crucial to understanding how you yourself can begin to transform that power. You need to understand it critically, and then you need to work out how to operationalise it. But this needs to be at the right level of abstraction. So it's not the case that you simply, because if you simply are, I don't know, Blair or whatever, then you're Blair and you're terrible. As we all understand, you're kind of grinning, death's head.
Pull back.
Kind of
Pull back.
Smart.
Don't go down there.
Okay.
Pull back.
Okay, I'll pull it back. So that's obviously bad. But then you need to understand. Okay, so there's a degree of abstraction. How is kind of power operating here? So when I talk about something like the architecture of choice, this is kind of quite a degree of abstraction. So it's the way that systems are set up so that they make some things easier than others. So if you're kind of in a kind of system which makes certain courses of action very easy, it's likely that most people will choose that course of action. So this is the way that kind of infrastructures shape our behaviour. So one of the things that you'd want to do if you think that our current behaviour is bad and the systems that they give rise to are deleterious to kind of human well-being, then you need to think, well, one of the ways that eventually we want to transform things is to think about how we're going to reshape those kind of structural conditions. Could be as simple as thinking about the way that, for example, urban infrastructures create, think about all the space given to cars, for example. So, especially in the kind of America, there's whole areas where you're basically locked into a certain kind of car-owning lifestyle because of the fact that the whole infrastructure is being designed with that in mind. So, if you genuinely wanted to stop people from using cars, you'd have to begin to redesign the way the cities are being built, the way that they're conditioning people's behaviour, because it's in certain places in America, you're going to create real problems for yourself if you don't have a car. The whole thing's been set up with that in mind. So if you're genuinely wanting to transform that, you can't just put it down to individual choice. You can't just say, be ethical and cycle to work, because maybe that's very difficult. Instead, you're going to have to think about how we're going to change the things that condition people's choices. So why are some things easier than others? So whilst this is the kind of thing that Blair would talk about, Blair's kind of strategic objective is kind of neoliberalism with a kind of quasi-human leering face, basically. So it's kind of like it's Thatcherism, but with a kind of a smile rather than sort of sneer. Now, this is not something that I'm interested in. So instead, thinking about strategy, what's the relationship between tactics and strategy? It's quite a complicated question with a slightly complicated answer. The overall objective has to be because of the nature of kind of action. So action tends to open up possibilities that you didn't know existed before. So there's a kind of very old school way of thinking about politics that gets critiqued, and it's called by people like the contemporary communalisation theorists. And they have this whole critique of what they call programmatism, the idea that you have a bullet point list. We're going to do this, then we're going to do that, then we're going to take over the state, then we're going to be there's going to be the dictatorship of the proletariat, and then they will run through these phases. This kind of bullet point program about how action is going to occur. So, while I don't agree entirely with their critique of programmatism, I think there's a problem with this kind of understanding of strategy as kind of absolute and entirely established in advance. So kind of in some of my recent research, I was thinking about the nature of strategy. You need to have an understanding about how kind of relatively kind of regional plans for action relate to your ability to succeed. So you need to have an orientation, you need to have kind of navigatory strategy, you need to have a sense of directionality, where you want to get to. But this shouldn't necessarily be exhaustive. So partly the total nature of your strategy is going to emerge partly through action. So if you look at kind of any kind of successful political movement, they're often groping in the initial stages for exactly even what they precisely believe is not necessarily clear. They have some vague ideas, and through discovering what works tactically, their strategy is kind of transformed. So I think there's a complex relationship between tactics and strategy in terms of configuring human action. I think also, though, you clearly do need to have at least some ideas about where you want to get to. In a book that I've recently co-authored and released, there's a large number of ideas about what are the kind of larger scale things would be good to aim towards. Okay, so question number 3: Is this neo-modernism, Marinetti, vorticism? I quite like vorticism. I'm not sure if necessarily it kind of inspires any of my ideas. I think neo-modernist is more interesting in a kind of broader sense, maybe. I think that I'd certainly argue that in a number of ways there are certain kind of thematics about the way that we view the world that need to be recovered from the kind of broad modernist moment. So the kind of things, but it needs to be recovered through the lens of kind of the postmodern critique. So it's working out what was important in modernism, but understanding that lots of it was kind of dubious and problematic, and working out what is recoverable from that. So there's an entire chapter in the book which basically talks largely about this. So it talks about, for example, what elements of the key kind of conceptual infrastructure of modernity can be kind of retained and in what sense. So I think there is an interesting relationship to neo-modernism here. Okay, now question 4. Narcissism of the localism. Does this result in a kind of, it becomes very technical, does it also result in a nihilism? Is it too technical? So I think this is also partly a question.
Also access.
Also access, yeah, exactly. So is this going to kind of reduce access because if the politics is very technical? Well, there's a question about degrees of abstraction, right? So there's a sense that you need to think about the relationship of particular local horizons to broader process. So this might not always be that technical. I mean, if you're going to fully understand it, it might be quite technical, but it might be the idea that it might change, for example, the way that you're kind of running a given local protest. It might be with an aim to convey a certain message or transform a certain debate. So you might want it to kind of operate in that way. That need not be necessarily very technical. The kind of technical stuff I was looking at more about how we represent complexity. And there it's really about how we make things more simple. So it's about how we, because there's a problem in that kind of both the kind of our kind of cognitive operations as given to us through evolution, and also the way that we've been kind of historically socialised, is not to deal with kind of very high degrees of technicality, complexity, and technical complexity. So when we're faced with it, we're often kind of so there was a whole lot of artworks that were produced after the 2008 crisis, maybe seen some of them, which are kind of based on what I would call the kind of financial complex sublime. So it's this idea that what gets presented is, I don't know, so the artist gets kind of various data streams coming out of key kind of markets, and these are then represented in some kind of visual display. And these are very interesting, but my kind of critique of that kind of whole approach is that it ends up with this kind of sublime, so you stand back in kind of awe and horror, so you're like, okay, this is very complicated and also frightening. But it doesn't give you any necessary kind of points of ingress, it doesn't give you any kind of like hooks. You don't, so if you're thinking, if the kind of didactic point of the artwork was to kind of inform you, the financial system is big and complex and scary, and it succeeds, but it doesn't necessarily leave you with much to do. What do you do about that? So maybe there's other forms of representational systems that actually make things, I mean, it has to be, if we're thinking about how to deal with complexity, it's about how we filter it down. So how do we simplify it? So the kind of, these would be kind of user interfaces, basically. So one of the ways that you would transform that is around kind of selecting what matters. And these would be ways that you'd make it not technical, you'd make it more simple. So in a sense, the media is a system which performs this on everything going on in the world. It simplifies things down into narratives. So maybe these aren't always very, accurate or good narratives, but certainly it's a complexity reduction system. It says this matters, this doesn't. This matters more than that. Pay attention to this. This is what you should feel about that. Often this is very kind of deleterious. We could think about, for example, how could we change the way the media operates? So the way it's filtering the complexity of the world is more relevant to what actually matters. Why is it that, for example, climate change isn't the #1 story every single day? Because it would seem that would be the most important story every day, but it's not. So they've done this kind of filtering process for you. So maybe there's ways that we need to think about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Just to take that up, it seems to me that I think Alex made the point very well that the media does filtering, but in a way the way in which complexity can be scaled and made accessible as a point of action is precisely through mediation and representation, which of course is an issue that you don't need to be in the media for, but you could do through the arts and other kinds of cultural practice. But what's necessary then is precisely to not be suspicious around mediation per se or representation per se, but to understand those as mechanisms, as kind of scaling mechanisms in a way, which are kind of political for that reason. Okay, we're going to stop because Alex has been working really hard. Thank you, Alex.